Well, hello, everybody. Welcome to Red May, a month-long vacation from capitalism. Tonight, capital is dead. This is something worse. But before we get into tonight's discussion, I want to let you know what's on tap for the next couple of days. On Thursday, tomorrow, 6 p.m., Climate Crisis Through the Lens of a Pandemic, with Theory of Franco's Nick Estes, Holly Jean Buck, Jeff Mann, moderator Olafemi Taiwo. Friday, we have at 5 p.m. Racial Capitalism and Disposable Populations in the Time of COVID-19. Chris Chen, Idris Robinson, John Clegg, Iko Day, Sarika Chandra with Chris Neelan as moderator. On Friday night, we have, Friday night, I'm sorry, Saturday afternoon, 1 p.m. These are Pacific Standard Time, by the way. Border Panic and Contagion with Wendy Trevino, Malav Kanuga, Dan Denver, Harsha Walia, and Jasper and Dylan as the moderator. And on Sunday at 1 p.m. Pacific time, we have Speculative Finance, Speculative Fiction with Jeff Mann, Charles Mudede, Steve Shaviro, Cheryl Vint, Marina Vishmet, and I will be moderating that. I would like to make a pitch for money. Give us money. We need money. To keep going, we need money. We have no institutional support since one of our slogans is be a commie for a month. So we depend on the kindness of strangers. We are basically Blanche Dubois incarnated with a red flag. And if you feel it in your hearts to give to us, more important, if you want to see this activity recur, not only in Seattle, but spread till we have a Red May New York, Red May Staten Island, Red May Prague, Red May Ouagadougou, then give to us. So you will find at the bottom of the YouTube description a link to click on, or you could go to our website, redmayseattle.org, and click on the donate button. So now, without further ado, I will turn the program over to our moderator tonight, Wendy Liu, the author of the new Abolish Silicon Valley, a very good idea, which she makes a persuasive case for. Please buy that book. Wendy, introduce our panelists, please.
Okay, great. Yeah. So first of all, thanks so much to everyone working behind the scenes at Red May to get this panel up. I know it takes a lot of work. And thank you to Philip for asking me to moderate. So for this panel, I am honored to be joined by McKenzie Wark, Alexander Zevin, and Jasper Bernes in order to discuss McKenzie's latest book, Capital is Dead, Is This Something Worse? So I'm going to introduce our panelists in order of speaking. First, we have McKenzie Wark, the author most recently of Capital is Dead, Is This Something Worse? Out from Verso last year, and Reverse Cowgirl out with Semiotext this year, as well as several other books. And she teaches at Eugene Lang College, the liberal arts division of the New School in New York City. And then we have Alexander Zevin, an assistant professor of history at City University of New York and an editor at New Left Review. He is the author of Liberalism at Large, The World According to the Economist, with Verso Books. And then we have Jasper Bernes, the author of a scholarly book, The Work of Art in the Age of Deindustrialization, with Stanford Press, 2017, and 2 books of poetry, Stars Down, 2007, and We Are Nothing and So Can You, 2015. He is currently completing The Communist Prospect About Revolution in the 21st Century for Verso Books. He lives in Berkeley with his family. And I'm Wendy Liu. As Philip mentioned, I've written a book called Abolish Silicon Valley. I'm a fairly recent convert to the left. My background is as a software engineer and startup developer, a startup founder. And one of the things that really helped me crystallize my political views was reading McKenzie Wark's 2004 book, A Hacker Manifesto. And I highly recommend that book to anyone who has a tech background or just really anyone who's kind of interested in these ideas around information. All right, so without further ado, we'll start with McKenzie with about a 20-25 minute presentation, and then we'll turn it over to the rest for responses. All right, go ahead.
Thank you. I just forgot to unmute myself. But now we're back. Hello, everyone. It does feel weird when I can't see who the rest of the audience is, but hello anyway. All right, so let me tell you a little bit about Capital is Dead. And I'm going to do it kind of informally because I think like lecturing in this format would just seem weird and it's probably no fun at all. So I'm just going to riff on it and hopefully the panel can call me on things that do not make sense. So there'll be plenty to talk about. So in saying capital is dead, or this is sort of Marxist truism, capital is dead labor is the formula. But maybe it's also dead something else. And that was one of the things I wanted to ask. It's already, a kind of congealed and crystallized version of more than one subordinate class. Marx was writing at the time when something like feudalism still existed, for example. So what if we started to think a little bit more broadly as to what it was, capital is dead, crystallized, but also the title has another sense of maybe this isn't even capitalism anymore, it's just something worse. And what would it mean to kind of think that? I think Marx was a thinker of emergent forms of exploitation. And yet weirdly, we seem somehow to be still using a language from the 1850s to describe this era. Marx was writing in the era of the steam engine. His notes on how steam engines work is not included in the collected works. David Razanov didn't think they were important enough. The telegraph was a thing. Electricity was a very, very new thing. So we don't quite live in that world. Maybe there's something we could talk about here. And I wanted to just go through some of the chapters. I probably won't get through the whole book to just give you some pieces of the argument that starts from that premise. And the first chapter is about language. And why do we keep using the same language? Isn't the whole thing about what Marx gave us is to think historically? And yet it seems to me we're stuck on this language where we treat capital as an essence and anything that changes is an appearance. And you can describe that by sticking a modifier in front of capitalism that represents the appearance while the essence remains unchanged. And then some of those modifiers then start to then also have modifiers on them. So we start to talk about post-Fordist capitalism or neoliberal capitalism. This is not good poetry, people. This is not a good way to use the English language. If you're adding all of these epicycles to an explanation, then maybe the sort of the fundamentals is a thing that one could look at here a little bit more closely. So what would it mean to think about there being a new mode of production on top of the other ones? And one of the things I want to be clear is by saying capital is dead, I don't mean capitalism itself has ended. There is a lot of it out there, but there are also other modes of production. The question is, which one is dominant? Marx was already writing in a time when there are other subordinate modes of production, and capital being the emerging dominant one. What if there was another dominant mode of production attaching itself to capital and then extracting a surplus out of those assembled other modes? So that's the thing I want to kind of think about. It's hard to do that. I framed the book as a thought experiment. People really, really want to hang on to this language. I get that because it's really hard to acquire it in the first place. Like if you have, slogged your way through the 3 volumes of Capital, you do not want to give up that. And I'm not asking anyone to. I'm asking really to read it a slightly different way, is to sort of ask not how do we take that language as given and apply it? How do we reproduce the whole experiment of thinking through a set of modes of exploitation in the present? Because I really think that was Marx's task. The other thing is we kind of really need this to be capitalism because communism comes next. There's a kind of a story that you can be wedded to. And you sort of think backwards from all the penultimate, end of history is communism. Therefore, this must be capitalism because that's the thing we're struggling to achieve. But what if there was a detour? What if there was another mode of exploitation after capital? Is a question I think is really begging to be asked when we sort of dive into this. So maybe we have to open up our narrative expectations a little bit, and maybe what a non-exploitative post-capitalist mode of production would look like might end up being a little bit different. So I wanted to frame it as, what if this isn't capitalism, it's something worse? Because there were all these narratives about capitalism went away and this is better, like the post-industrial revolution and Computopia. It was like a Cold War trope to kind of say, we solved all that, it's not a problem. And we have a new thing after capitalism that's better. And so, the rhetorical strategy here is, what if it's actually worse? And so, what would it mean then to describe that new dominant mode that's kind of attaching itself limpet-like to the subordinate ones underneath it? And to do that, I think one needs to think about forces of production. We sort of started to stop thinking so much that you needed to know that in any kind of detail, because the early schools of Marxism are very interested in the relations of production, and then the superstructure built on top of that. And the forces gets left out of it a little bit, because you kind of need a little bit of technical knowledge, or you need to approach it collaboratively to kind of just understand what, forces of production are. And the moment I think that really starts to diverge is the creation of information science, which I pegged to 1948, and the work of Claude Shannon. You could also use Turing. There are other people you could talk about. But it's finally possible to treat information not just as a descriptor, but as something that you can manipulate and quantify. That to me is a new thing in the world. There's a kind of ontology to information, a kind of thing about its being that's extremely difficult to grasp, and is not well understood in the kinds of 19th century materialism that Marx was dealing with. Marx was thinking at a time of thermodynamics as kind of a new thing, and he's trying to wrap his head around it. When you add information to that, you have a different picture of reality and different ways that forces of production evolve to manipulate and transform what it is that the material world actually is. So I want to spend a little bit of time, and I don't do a whole lot in this book because I'm, unlike Wendy, not an engineer. I washed out of computer science. I used to be able to tool around in Unix, but I can't anymore. But it seems to me that it's kind of important to know that that's one of the sciences that had a transformative effect on all the others. There's a way in which all of the sciences become informatic. There's a sort of cybernetic program that never really worked out in the way it was framed in the 40s and 50s, but willy-nilly, incrementally, everything became computational in terms of how you produce knowledge. Then that became instrumentalized as well. And became a force of production. And that, I think, is a thing one has to view as transformative as the Industrial Revolution was. So that's the force of production part. All right, who is producing the information? One of the answers is us. And what's kind of interesting about where whatever this mode of production is ended up, is it's able to extract information out of all of us. And that's kind of how it works. It works on an information asymmetry, like you go online or you open up your phone because there's a piece of information that you want or that you want to share. And you get that bit often for free, right? So for the tariff of being on your service, yeah, you can have that bit that you want. But in the process, you are giving up more information than you actually receive. And also all of the aggregate value of that information is privatized. None of us have access directly to what Facebook knows or what Google knows. Occasionally you see scholars, tool around with the data sets, but they can't actually give you the data sets. So it isn't even kind of science, right? So we don't know what they know. There's an asymmetry at work. But then I think there's also kind of a form of specialized labor that's not even maybe even quite labor anymore to produce new information that intellectual property is able to latch onto. It's different to industrial labor because the whole thing about industrialization is producing standardized units of the same thing. It's about sameness. But what does it mean to produce something different, and where the measure of its value is the potential of its difference? Like, that strikes me as what's kind of weird about the jobs that many of us do. You write a book, you write some code, you make some music, you do some science, like all of those things. And to stop thinking of them as separate and against each other, but to think of all of that from the point of view of a ruling class that treats it all as information that can be quantified, treated as forms of property, circulated, and from which value can be extracted. So what if there was a kind of another kind of exploited class? I call them the hacker class in a hacker manifesto. I honestly don't care what you call it. And in some ways, it makes sense to think of us as labor, like by all means, join your union, right? And think of what you do as labor. But it doesn't quite make sense always to speak in the traditional language of labor when the thing you're asked to do, and more importantly, your power to intervene in it is different. If what you're doing, for example, is designing systems or producing systems within which other things for somebody else will be repeated, that's not quite the same thing as doing that repetitive labor. So I don't want to make a big song and dance about hacker class as an entirely exploited class. It's ambiguous. And it's useful to think of classes as having ambiguous politics as well. The precedent for this is the way the labor movement had to think about peasants. What's the worker-peasant relationship? Well, peasants want to own their own freaking land. They're basically small landholders. They don't think like labor. So you had to kind of think an external relation between classes. And I think that's useful. I'm thinking about the kinds of alliances, what in my terms a hacker of worker alliance would be. Like, what is the shared interest, but also where do they diverge? And where are those things different? Like, that might be worth thinking about in those terms. All right, so, and the way you track that there might be something novel about this is in that thing that's in between, in Marxist terms, base and superstructure, which is law. How did property law expand to include forms of information as things that can be commodified in ways that are completely unimaginable in Marx's time? Marx is writing the time of copyright and patent, but those things get bent out of shape in unbelievable ways, and trademark becomes like a massively important part of this, as does trade secret. There are all these ways in which law starts to create categories of things, such that if you look at the annual reports of some of the world's biggest companies now, most of their assets are intangible. Apple does not make phones, right? Google does not make a damn thing as far as I can tell. Now, it's not immaterial. They have a huge infrastructure that they own and control that, among other things, consumes massive amounts of energy. So I'm not saying it's immaterial at all, but it's really not quite the same thing as, you know, a car factory employing thousands of people with a huge plant and a huge investment in it as fixed capital. Those things kind of went away and became things that this new ruling class, they call the vectorist class, are able to then subcontract out. So Apple will subcontract out the making of the phone to somebody else. Now that company will of course try to gain as much control as possible over the value chain. Apple will struggle against it by owning the intellectual property, by owning all of the information about the value circuit and so on. So we sort of start to see how these modes of production nest and overlap. Then, all right, so that's if you like the synchronic view, like a snapshot through the social formation. Then how does this affect how we think about history? It would be to think that the transformation in the forces of production responding to the crisis of productivity in the 70s is the crucial part. Yeah. So in the overdeveloped world, labor is able to bid up the price of wages to the point that it's rising faster than the rate of productivity. What does the ruling class do? Well, one thing it does is try to outsource production to other places, but to do that involves a massive investment in an information infrastructure to keep the pieces of it together. So you then start to involve companies that own that infrastructure. But the next thing you find out is that those companies are getting control of the value chain and starting to become the dominant form of control. You control it not by owning the physical plant, you control it by owning the information that moves between each of the pieces. So to sort of start thinking a little bit differently about, and the sort of political correlate of that is I can't even say it, neoliberalism, but to not see it as causative, it's reactive, yeah? So what are the policy prescriptions that allow you to do that? And to see financialization as only part of it. Like financialization only works if you've got a kind of information infrastructure that's making all of the actual physical things move around the planet in the first place. Like those two things are mapped onto each other. So to not look only at the superstructure, but look much more at the base, at the growth of logistics, for example. All right, so that would be the historical piece. And I think that gives you an interesting way of thinking about a less Eurocentric version of this story too. We could put China back in the picture, look at the way Deng Xiaoping decided to actually take that, to sort of take the outsourcing of manufacturing, to use that as a way to kind of like grow a kind of commodified standard of living that would keep the party in power. But then the move more and more to control the whole value chain and to even build out an information infrastructure, which is the current sort of Xi Jinping era of whatever China is trying to do, is basically build the entire logistics system out from under the American EU control. Truly astonishing world historical project, which I'm in no way justifying or signing on to, but it's just a thing that if you're not paying attention to that, it's like, that's just such a central piece of what's happening in history right now. A lot more could be said about that, and I'm not by no means an expert on it. All right. I sort of maybe won't go into the part that sort of gets from this to that all this is happening in the context of the Anthropocene, where we all know this really just can't go on for very much longer at all. Other than to say that the production of the vector of information, the turning into absolutely everything on the planet as a potential resource for commodification, and then the building of a whole series of instruments on top of that for speculating in it, basically makes all resources of the planet available within the same matrix of potential commodification, and has massively sped up the production of a way of life that's completely unsustainable. So I won't get into the chapter on this is sort of the more philosophical one. I won't get into that so much. And I just want to conclude by saying, I think to think this, you've got to be that thing that was like the bad thing in the sort of militant circles I was raised in from 1978 through the 80s, was you're really not supposed to be a vulgar Marxist. Like that was the thing you were not supposed to be. I always used to think, does that mean we're supposed to be genteel Marxists? I thought we were against ruling classes. Like, why is vulgar a bad thing? So I wanted to sort of embrace vulgarity. Now, the other thing was the people who were telling me this were themselves extremely vulgar, hard drinking, sort of militants who would, get drunk at the workers' club, but somehow vulgar Marxism was somehow bad. And it did never quite fit in my head, So what if we return to a particularly vulgar approach that really does look at the forces of production first, not to treat them as exogenous. There are a whole series of historical social factors that determine what forces of production get developed, but that the transformative potential of applied science is really quite real. And I think that we sort of lost the ability to connect to. There's a way in which there are whole branches of Marxism that have no connection to the even to the social sciences, let alone the technical and scientific spheres. And I think that's a huge loss. And there's a Cold War history to how the left in the sciences and technical fields was much more aggressively shut down than elsewhere that I think we really need to attend to. So yeah, 4 cheers for vulgar Marxism, like 4 because it's a little vulgar, it's a little excessive, yeah. And in that chapter, I singled out Andrei Platonov, Angela Davis, Asger Jorn, and Piero Pasolini, who were people in one or another kind of involved in transformations in the labor process, in particular forms of struggle emerging at the end of the 60s through the 70s. And I think had a really quite good grasp on how you thought about what new modes of production were, how information was becoming value, new sites of struggle, and so on. So I sort of just wanted to start there. The coda to the book is a reading of that film on the young Marx, the maker of which is eluding me. I can't remember his name. But the thing that struck me about that is it's a film about what Marx and Engels do is come up with a new language, that they sort of interrupt the kind of existing culture from without of sort of militant artisanal workers because they see something new has arrived, the industrial worker. So what does it mean to think from the point of view of the advanced forms of the exploited class in the 21st century? That seems to me to be the task. And hence why I think maybe let's talk about a new language for thinking about the forms of exploitation that we find ourselves in. That's it. That's the pitch.
Great. Thank you so much for that. Now we're going to turn to Alexander.
Great. I'm very happy to be here and to talk about McKenzie's new book, Capitalism is Dead. I'm glad that you ended, McKenzie, on the note about vulgar Marxism, because one of the things that I appreciated most about this book was its rehabilitation of vulgarity within the Marxist tradition. I've long wanted to champion vulgar Marxism, and now I have an excuse to. I wanted to explore the kind of chain of associations that your discussion of vulgar Marxism brought to my mind, especially in the current moment, and to sort of to riff on it as you did in your introduction. So you had a passage in the book that I to quote it to now. You say, The old culture industries had figured out how to commodify leisure. The organized labor movement had struggled hard for free time for working people. Capital was forced to compromise, but it found a way to commodify leisure time as well as work time. The old culture industries at least had to make products that held our attention. In the post-broadcast era, the culture industries are superseded by the vulture industries. They don't even bother to provide any entertainment. We have to entertain each other while they collect the rent. So the idea that we live not under the sign of the culture industry, but under the sign of the vulture industry interested me for a few reasons. One, because if we had to attach a name to, or one modified name to our current capitalism, as many would, I think I would, financialized capitalism, neoliberal capitalism, we of course are often talking about vulture capitalists, you know, the bondholders and rogue bondholders who, you know, when an Argentine ship comes into port in Africa, seize it, for example. But I also thought of the way that you know, this reference to an earlier understanding of the culture industry from Horkheimer and Adorno in the dialectic of the Enlightenment, from their text from 1944, the way that this is or is not potentially a form of vulgar Marxism that you are seeking to rehabilitate. Obviously, Adorno and Horkheimer had a pretty different conception of culture, I think, than you lay out in this book. It was far more homogenous in the sense in which Adorno and Horkheimer understood the danger of American the American culture industry as being quasi-totalitarian, or having a kind of totalitarian latency within it, where everyone had the freedom to choose, but ultimately chose to be the same. Whereas I think that, you know, the way that you understand culture, the way you treat cultural objects and artifacts in your book is more heterogeneous, with more of a sense of play. At any rate, I just wanted to kind of pursue that a little bit further, because it also brought to mind the fact that in the 2000s, just before the last crash that we experienced, I remember very clearly that New York Magazine launched shortly after being bought by the financier, a private equity tycoon and mergers and acquisition king, Bruce Wasserstein, bought the New York Magazine and launched a series of kind of online ventures, and one was known as Vulture. And here the idea was that New York itself was the sort of cultural oyster that, or carcass, I guess, that vultures culture vultures would swoop into to experience. And it sort of, I thought it nicely bridged, in part because I'm interested in the history of publications. My book is on the magazine. I thought it nicely bridged the older culture industry that you describe as entertaining us, in which New York City figures as a destination for tourists, and one in which you know, the residents of New York City become more or less glorified tourists. And you know, between 2007 and today, we live in a very different city, a city that I think may look unrecognizable, all of the worst features of which may have been you know, completely exacerbated by the current crisis that we find ourselves in which parks are no longer places to gather, but actually, in terms of the High Line, ways of increasing the real estate value of the surrounding property, and in the case of things like Hudson Yards or Billionaires Row on 57th Street, you know, these skyscrapers that you can't see the top of from the street below. So I just thought of Vulture as a kind of a way of reading a cultural product on terms that you suggest, as in a somewhat vulgar way, as it were, as a manifestation of a financialized form of capitalism, or as you put it, vectorialism. And I have a question about that, but it you know, another way of framing it, another artifact that I thought of while I was thinking about your text and the way that it related to my own experience of living in New York City and the changes that have taken place over the course of the development of a certain kind of capitalism based in New York, was the difference between Hackers, which a film I recently rewatched, which I think is an incredible movie. But part of what struck me about it, watching it, and I don't know if everyone has seen the film Hackers here, but one of the things that struck me about it was that it was made in 1996, and its conception of what the internet was, and of what disrupting the internet meant, and of what it meant to free information. It's completely utopian. It's a Hollywood film. It's, you know, not sort of an independent film, even in the vulgar sense. But it just 10 years later, the Devil Wears Prada. I looked up films that came out a decade later because it seemed like a different world to me. 10 years later, New York is the Devil's Wear Prada. You know, it's not about high school students breaking into corporate headquarters and stealing information. It's about getting an internship at Vogue, and you know, and such like. So I just I wanted to I had more to say about that, but whether you're amused by my reflections on the film Hackers or not, I'm going to power forward and talk a little bit about my some of my questions, basically about the points that the excellent points you make in the book. So I guess I wanted to respond to the provocations. McKenzie in the book says very explicitly that she is seeking to provoke, and so I want to respond in the same spirit, but to push back a little bit on just certain points, or to ask for clarification. So, you know, one of the points that McKenzie makes is about this language issue, about what we call capitalism, and whether or not it's adequate to, whether or not it's good poetry, as she said in her introduction, to constantly seek modifications to the word. One thing that I thought was slightly interesting about this is that it may be the case that in critical theory and among left milieus, that capitalism is and neoliberalism are sort of constantly invoked in ways that may denude them of meaning. But it's only recently, actually, that it's been possible to hear the word capitalism, let alone neoliberalism. I mean, the Financial Times, the New York Times, until very recently, just simply wouldn't pronounce those words. They didn't appear in print. So, I mean, one thing I'm interested in is, what does it mean based on your own reading of your own sort of parsing of the language, that these terms, which, you know, are terms that the left has been so comfortable with for so long, have now made their way into the mainstream, which wasn't the case before. The other thing I guess I wanted to ask, or to sort of seek clarity on, is that, you know, for all the limitations of describing capitalism, and you list a number of ways in which the term has been modified: merchant capitalism, liberal capitalism, monopoly capitalism, or financial capitalism. Perhaps it's in part because I'm an historian, and for me, you know, you cannot not periodize, to quote Jameson. There's something helpful about thinking about capitalism in phases, which is different to me than either a sort of essentializing it, or sort of some kind of crude theological assumption that, you know, this is the final and last stage, and then finally we'll get to communism. So I thought that there are really two advantages to that, the form of modification that you're pushing against. I just wanted to kind of mention them in the context of your own argument. So first of all, I think what it does, and I think you get at this yourself when you talk about the dominant forms of capitalism. It allows us to not only name the dominant form of capitalism, monopoly or financial capitalism, at the turn of the 20th century, but it also, I think, lets us set current transformations of capital with relation to current or prior forms, or overlapping forms. So, for example, you know, on page, in the introduction to the book, or in the first chapter maybe, there is a discussion about the way that information may have fundamentally altered capitalism a new name, but I wonder if there isn't a way of thinking about information or vectoral capitalism or vectorialism as really being a function in the same way that the crisis of the 70s provoked a response on the part of the ruling class. To what extent is this informational revolution, or in quotes, a response to the sort of low productivity, low growth, stagnation of capitalism? What are the big innovations of the gig economy? Well, they're taxi cabs. I mean, they do a thing that isn't particularly new or innovative, really, in any classical conception of what capitalism has done from the combustion engine going forward. What they do is they sort of cannibalize other forms of labor and work and extract profit from them. And I thought in this connection of Robert Solow's famous quip, you can see the computer age everywhere, but in the productivity statistics. So the idea that what really is information doing? It may be that it's changed capitalism in some ways that render it unrecognizable, but in other ways it seems like it's very much dependent on the sort of decrepitude or continuous mode of production. The second thing I wanted to just quickly mention, I don't want to talk too long, is the way in which naming the dominant mode of capital, or the way in which adding that modifier, which may be bad poetry, also allows us to talk about the strategic ways in which capitalism can be resisted or challenged in that conjuncture. If it's financial capital that is at the root of imperialism, then it means that it's the thing that needs to be the focus of socialist action to be brought under control, as an example. So when you talk about information as being the kind of dominant mode, what forms of resistance does that allow us to see or to understand? What would it mean to try and bring that to heel? And I know you address this in the book, but I wondered if you could, for this audience, talk more about that, because there are a variety of sort of reformist and more radical proposals. Shoshana Zuboff, who has written this massive tome, has after talking for a really long time about the dangers, the perils that are posed by surveillance capitalism, comes up with quite mild sort of possibility of breaking up big tech, regulating the industry better, and other forms of legislation, the right to be forgotten, that the EU has implemented. And I know that you would sort of want to push further. So there's Evgeny Morozov, who has a kind of socialized the data centers and approach. And so I guess I just wanted to know if you could tell us the way in which the focus on information does something for not just to allow us to analyze and understand the contradictions for formation, but also what it allows us to do, or what its limits might be when it comes to pushing back, to resisting it, or to revolution. Thanks.
Thank you. Wendy, how do you want to proceed?
I was thinking, if it's okay with you, can we let Jasper go on first, and then we'll return to you for questions?
We got Jasper though?
Jasper, you're on mute.
Yeah, thanks. So thanks. Thanks, McKenzie and Alexander and Wendy, for inviting me to talk about this. It's something I'm actually really interested in, this question of, is this capitalism? Because I think that even though McKenzie and I come down probably on different sides of it, I think that the stakes of that question are really interesting, because implicit in that question is, I think, a definition of what capitalism is. And that's, of course, really important if we're going to have a conversation that's, meaningful at all. And we also have to not only define capitalism, but also say why it matters that something is capitalism or not, right? Why do we care about this object called capitalism? Why does it matter as a kind of theoretical object, which, to a lot of people isn't that obvious. And if you don't do that, then you get a kind of discussion, and you see this a lot among Marxist nerds, where they agree on a given set of predicates and yet are nonetheless disagreeing, but only over a name. And that's, and I think that's that kind of the sort of narcissism of small differences that starts to multiply with these adjectives, monopoly capitalism versus this kind of capitalism, I think is in some sense a part of that problem. But I also think, it's not just a matter of the definition of what capitalism is, but also, a theory of how we transition, how a transition away from capitalism might happen. And that's something that, there's a lot to be said about. And we have examples of other modes of production. We have an example of the transition from to capitalism and the emergence of capitalism, but there's no reason to think that what comes after capitalism, and I happen to agree there's many things that could come after it, that the transition from capitalism will resemble the transition to capitalism in any sort of way, right? So we can't assume that, right? Because human history is in fact, quite complicated, and maybe modes of production, the relationship of the concept of mode of production to the totality of human history is also uncertain. That's not something that, is a very developed area of theory. So, so I think all of that is really interesting. And I think that the point that Alexander brought up about kind of these mid-century modes of thought, that thought to identify, in capitalism, this kind of emergent transformation away from capitalism towards this kind of, oftentimes it was the kind of corporatist, totalitarian, authoritarian, bureaucratic mode. There were a lot of theories of that saw the convergence between the Soviet Union and the United States, and the emergence towards some kind of fixed, centralized, bureaucratic, hierarchical mode of production that was no longer based on the market as much. And that didn't happen. But I think there's nothing to say, there's no real reason to assume that it couldn't have, right? And perhaps, in some, is it impossible that, that capitalism in the United States and Japan and Europe couldn't have evolved into some other thing, after the 60s? Theoretically, it's certainly not. Whether that was historically possible remains another question. So what I'm trying to say is, certainly we could always identify, there's probably if there's a transition possible, we always would be able to identify the elements central to that transition that are emergent within capitalism. But I think that that's something other than saying, that we no longer have the object we call capitalism. So certainly whenever the transition from capitalism happens, right, we would be able to point to all kinds of elements that anticipated it. But that does not mean that the presence of those elements themselves means that that it's not capitalism, especially because we probably have some idea of a kind of a break, right? Some moment where there's a kind of things are hanging together in some way. And I think that just if we were going to give a definition of capitalism, and we could do it in terms of the essences that McKenzie talks about in her book, but I don't think we need to. And, I think that if we're going to define capitalism, there's definitions that work from empirically graspable particulars. We don't need to talk about value or surplus value at all. We could talk about capitalism involving generalized wage dependency. People are dependent upon wages to survive. There are contract relations for alienable property backed by state power. These are kind of legal innovations that took a long time to come into place. The ability to sue people in courts over property, generalized production for profit in the market. Most people are working in workplaces that are oriented to producing something and selling it on the market in order to kind of make an extra buck. And then the commodification of both wage goods and capital goods. And, everything is for sale. And, I just think that this isn't Marxism. There's no theory here. There's no theory of value or anything like that. It's just a description of a set of things that have been associated with capitalism that still pertain in this world. We do live in a world of generalized wage dependency, and most people work in places that are related to production for profit in the market. So I think that that's a kind of place to start. And to say that is to say that capitalism still kind of holds together and has this kind of force over people's life, even if, and I agree that it's in this kind of decaying mode where it has to kind of rely on these sort of parasitic mechanisms in order to kind of perpetuate itself. We're in this kind of moment of deindustrialization, and the kind of morbid symptoms that come out in that moment, of course, they could become the kernel of some other kind of new thing. That's what we want to look for. So, I agree in that sense. And I think maybe then, some of the disagreement is semantic, and I hate semantic disagreements. I think it's those Marxists. So, but is in this kind of moment of COVID-19 and the kind of transformation of our lives and of our economies over the last 4 months, for me, I think what it shows is how much we are in capitalism and how much we still live in a world defined by generalized wage dependency. The crisis of unemployment that we've seen and the crisis of consumer purchasing power that's produced, and the kind of panicked reaction on the part of both kind of the people in charge of the kind of economy at the Federal Reserve and, in the White House and in Congress has been quite remarkable. And I think it just shows how much we are still a society of workers and of kind of, sort of wage dependent people. And what we see is that the pandemic shows us how much we're in capitalism precisely because it interrupted it, but it proves that actually we're still very, very much in capitalism because people depend upon these kinds of capitalist reproductive methods to survive. They depend upon wages. They depend upon there being somewhere to spend their money on the things that they need. And when those things break down, all of society breaks down. Now, perhaps the pandemic is an opportunity for other modes of arranging life to come to the fore. And I think that that's quite possible. Kind of the emergence of kind of new technologies of kind of surveillance and distribution that might, not be market mediated or market based in this kind of moment to solve the kinds of problems of social distancing and reproduction that the pandemic introduces. I think there's a lot of companies that would like to get in on that, and maybe that would be, the emergence of some new kind of thing. But I think that what's remarkable is how little attempt to move against capitalism there's been. People sometimes talk about, this as being a time for planning and nationalization, but there's really been almost none of it, right? Very, very little a willingness to actually interfere with production itself. The kind of the power of the market has been assumed to be, essentially totalizing, and there have been massive kinds of, unprecedented interventions, but not interventions in production itself, only in circulation, only in the banks, only in terms of putting, money in people's hands. And to me, that says that capitalism is still really, even more now than ever, the only game in town. And so, that's to me, I think but nonetheless, I think that, when people talk about coming up with these really complicated systems for, surveillance and tracking of people, trying to maintain people in moments where they can't access labor and having a massive kind of unemployed class that's going to have to be, given some kind of universal basic income, those kinds of things maybe actually start to look like they wouldn't be capitalism. But I think that we need to have a good definition if we're going to kind of know what it is, what it isn't, and be able to understand, a transition when it's here. So, I think that's sort of my, my counter provocation, as it were, that what we right now is just how much we are in capitalism, and it's really a capitalism on life support, right? But that just proves that the amount of the life support, the kind of ventilator that they have the economy attached to right now, proves how much we are in capitalism, right? Really. And their unwillingness to even try anything different, even slightly different, unwillingness to nationalize one mask company, right? Their willingness to send, slaughterhouse workers back to work and cut them off unemployment, benefits. Like that really, to me, shows how much the most kind of ruthless and brutal sort of capitalism is in control right now, sadly. So I don't know. That's sort of that's where I land with all of this.
All right, great. Thank you so much, both of you. I think now let's turn it over to McKenzie. Feel free to respond to any of the questions or issues raised, and then I will ask some questions of my own.
Thank you. Thank you, Alex and Jasper. I think Mark said something very wise when he talked about the way people fight the current kind of situation in the language of the previous one. So he's essentially saying that we respond to political moments through cosplay, and so like chef's kiss, that he does it with a completely made up quote from Hegel. So it's like as if we didn't know that was already a dead dog. But to me, this is kind of a sort of fundamental point that we tend to try to interpret the present through precedent. And in so doing, we see how the present looks like the past, but we can miss the way that it's different, which was one of the things I think Marx was continually trying to alert us to. So that's how I think about language. Now, what was my second point? I'm just trying to make sense of the point I was trying to, it's kind of late in the game where something like Uber tries to like destroy the taxi industry, because it's sort of like low-hanging fruit for things that you would like radically transform. We're all kind of gone, meaning this is a done deal. We're already in something new. Like information is kind of the glue that holds together the entire value chain in a way that was just not the case, and I think I'm the oldest person here, so I kind of remember that era, so it's like it's taxis with better data, and then you just use, the money you've accumulated to use lawyers to like break down regulation. Yeah, it's not a terribly innovative strategy. But the thing is, all the fundamental stuff really happened 30 years ago, and all this is built on top of that. So a lot of the language about tech comes way too late to understand when the fundamental transformations happen. That's why I'm making the key date here, 1948. Now, it takes a long time for those things to kind of flow through into becoming a dominant layer to techniques that will control all of the other ones. But to me, that's the revolutionary transformation. It's no longer information as a sort of subsidiary thing to the production of things. It's information is the main thing that controls production. And in many industries, all that's produced. So like, that's the thing that I think we're not quite getting at. And Alex's question about resistance connects, I think, a little bit to where Jasper landed in terms of like, why are we not seeing mass movements is, look, we have to come to terms with defeat, that all of the historic strands of the labor movement were defeated in the overdeveloped world. There are some exceptions somewhere, there are occasional reversals, but the tendency has been bad. Going way back to the people who trained me, who remembered 56 and remembered 68, they were already thinking through how were we defeated and how do we rethink it? And so to me, that's the tradition that I want to stick up for. And these people are not Marxist nerds. Like, I'm not terribly interested in the hair splitting about whether the Soviet Union was a deformed worker state or a worker state that had been deformed, over which Trotskyist groupuscules would, fan out, not really what they wanted to do. They were kind of practical people. But I think one has to sort of think really quite fundamentally about, if we're defeated, how do you rethink praxis, and what kinds of alliances in what kinds of language would now be possible, and to learn from that. So yeah, I mean, we always periodize, but at what point are we periodizing at this scale, and at what point are we periodizing at that scale? You know, when are we talking about modifications within a longer historical tendency, and when does it jump to the next level? And I think it's time to sort of ask that question. Hence the provocation: is this capitalism or something worse? And of course, it still has a lot of the features that capitalism had. One of the things you notice is that new things sort of insinuate themselves within the form of old things. Like half the buttons on my screen are old-fashioned things, like the mute button is a little microphone. The stop video is like, looks like a little video camera from the 70s. Skeuomorphs, as designers used to call it. Yeah, like you make people think it's something they're familiar with, and you insert the new thing in the back of it. Like that's kind of how, you know, product development works. I just don't think it's how theory should work. I think we ought to do something different. Because yeah, like most people are still wage dependent, but you notice the tendency is to disaggregate that into micropayments based on very specific instances of performativity. The reason you couldn't do that in the old factory setting is it was really hard to make sure everybody was actually doing their fucking jobs. Hence you needed foremen, hence you needed the production line, but you just gave someone the pay packet at the end of the day. And in my day, literally an envelope of cash with the coins in it, yeah? That was the classic capitalism that people were writing about even last century. Not how things work now. And you see like an increasing tendency to disaggregate wage, disaggregate labor into components, to monitor and track the specific things that people do. So maybe it's not even quite the wage relation. And yes, we still have contracts, but the things you can contract are as different now as they were under capitalism as what you could contract under capitalism was from feudalism. The whole legal revolution makes capitalism possible on one level. It's the superstructural feta that needed developing. We've done that again. So you can have contracts about things that don't kind of exist outside of the information world. Like that was really not a thing that you could do. And yes, so there's a whole part of this political economy runs on profit. There's a bigger part of it that runs on derivatives, right? And it's really not quite a good answer to say it's all fictitious, because it's kind of all information about probabilities of things that might happen based on things that we know about the actual world. So there's more money to be made in the information about what goes on than in doing the thing that goes on. Like it's kind of like a fundamentally different thing. Rather than call it neoliberal, calling it like Black-Scholes capitalism, I'd actually kind of go for, if we were to call it a version of it. Like Black-Scholes did the equations that made derivatives possible. And I actually don't think financialization is the most interesting piece of the vector in the current story. But if you wanted one that tracks that, like that would be the one to really feature. So how do you use a piece of science, essentially a piece of mathematics? How do you make mathematics a force of production is one of the things the late 20th century really figured out to do, which is astonishing if you think about the history of that field. We do have to think about the paradox that the ruling class seems to have got richer in the last 3 months, even though none of us are working. So how the hell was that possible? I don't know. I haven't really thought that through, but there does seem to be something weird about that kind of breaks out of the model a little bit. And I think where Jasper and Alex and I know with Jasper, I certainly we're on the same page, is what we want is a very different mode of production to this one. And whether you would still call it a mode of production is a kind of interesting, slightly academic side of it. Maybe that wouldn't quite be the appropriate language, but we want to transform it into something else. But I think sometimes you have to ask about whether thinking it through in a language that we've inherited rather than thinking of the language for ourselves would be one way to get out of to stop reproducing the kind of family romance of concepts that we inherited and kind of do it for ourselves. So that's cool where I land on this. But thank you both.
If either Alex or Jasper wants to respond to any of that, feel free.
Sorry. Hi. Yeah. I guess I just would. Thanks for that. That was very interesting. I was just wanted to know if you could comment a little bit, because your book comes into a field that is people are discussing quite a bit now. And the last part of my question about sort of you sort of began to address it with this issue about the mode of production and what comes next, but sort of given the variety of options on the table, what are the shortcomings of the kind of reformist approach to the problem of, I mean, Elizabeth Warren had a plan for that, right? What are the limits of that within our, I mean, if you care to address it, just because I think that, precisely because part of your argument is this is worse, right? So if it's so bad, then those sorts of solutions won't do it. I just wondered if you could talk very briefly a bit more about that.
It turned out the state was incredibly porous, and you could route around it and produce a whole other infrastructure. And there are still fractions of the ruling class that see capture of the state as a way to kind of loot it. But what's kind of interesting is the way to like disaggregate the pieces of it, where it becomes a kind of shell. So that's where the Warren level reformism just really wasn't going to work. And in any port in a storm, that there was a kind of social democratic movement to the left of that seemed absolutely necessary, and sort of prompted by even further left groups. But we've seen that that's kind of not possible in the United States. So, honestly, I'm not optimistic about where you would go with that. But, having been raised in very much popular front version of Marxism, that seemed to me to be like the strategy. I'm aesthetically very interested in avant-garde groupscules with exotic languages, but I'm more politically interested in something like a popular front strategy.
Okay, I'm just going to chime in with a question from the audience. This is a bit of a clarification question. Could you define victorialism and explain why it's a useful term for us to understand the current landscape?
And God knows if it's useful. I'm not wedded to the language whatsoever. And its vector, as I was just thinking of it in geometry. Like a vector is like a line of fixed length, but no fixed position. Has slightly different definitions in different sciences, but the simplest one's geometry, right? Vector, it's fixed in one aspect, like that's its length, but it can be in any position. And that strikes me as a way of thinking about what you do with information, because it's not so much the information, it's moving it about and connecting it to other things. So it's like, that vector joined to that one, and on you go. It's a good thing I've got my makeup brushes here. So I use vector as like a simple way of thinking about what was it that was able to disaggregate the spatial form of capitalism. And it was kind of like moving information about was the thing that did it. So to think about a ruling class that is really interested mostly in control of the vector, and that then actually has three components. So there's the flow of information, there's stocks of it, yeah, and there's also the ownership of whatever gets produced in the form of intellectual property. So there are like a few, at least three kind of pieces we could think of as vector. So it's like line between points that are kind of abstract, which is, information is real, but it's abstract is the thing to get our head around. So yeah, who are the companies that really don't seem to want to own the force of production anymore? They own the vector. And the obvious ones are like the brand names on your screen at the moment. Yeah. So this is an Apple computer. I have like Google up there in the background, but they're sort of the tip of the iceberg and the ones that are sort of consumer facing. But there are others. Yeah. There are other companies that own the pharmaceutical vectors, or there are ones that own the medical one. You go to the doctor, it's all on a screen now, right? So your doctor is just basically, plugging in inputs into that. Like the exam is shorter than doing the information management when you go to the doctor, et cetera. So every single industry starts to have that kind of dimension to it. The one I use as an example is the company Archer Daniels Midland. I mean, anybody who listens to NPR and PBS, that sort of stuff, has probably seen their ads. And that's a company that in history of, the United States has been all three, yeah? It started out as a land holding company, then it went into food production, and it's now about GMOs, yeah? So it's still residually those other things, but it's been through those three layers of transformation. First of all, own land, which is even a kind of arguably pre-capitalist, landlord approach. Then you own the factories that produce the processed food. And then it's like, you could just outsource all that, but let's own the information about the seeds that are going to be planted so that we can extract the rent from it forevermore. So that would be the explanation of why I chose a vectorless class, but call them whatever you like.
Just to comment on that. So I live in San Francisco and I'm part of the DSA chapter here. And we recently had a reading group that was about Capital is Dead. And because it's San Francisco, a lot of the people in the group were tech workers, former or current. And we found the concept of vectors to be a really useful one for understanding what's going on, because a lot of us work for these tech companies or have worked for these tech companies. And the way we talked about it was, you have these companies that own not just the data or the code, but they own the gateways, which may be, the corresponding term for vectors, but they own, say, like the domain names, where that is what allows them to accumulate data. That's what makes the code useful. And so then it's not just a matter of them owning, these specific pieces of code. They're owning this whole process, this whole like funnel that allows them to extract and allows them to have these really dominant positions in these global value chains. And I think at some point in your book, you talked about other companies and how it's not just, these big tech companies, but all these other companies who are doing the same thing. And if you look at intellectual property and how that has contributed to the valuations of companies like Nike, for example, or pharmaceutical companies, then that makes a lot more sense. And it helps us to see that the tech industry is not this aberration. It's not just something completely different, but it's, part of how capitalism has evolved. So yeah, we all thought that was a really interesting concept. And then a question that I wanted to ask, I guess everyone on the panel, we haven't really spent a lot of time talking about coronavirus. Maybe that's good. It's probably nice to have a bit of a break from that, but it would also be good to have maybe a few thoughts on how that's changing our socioeconomic landscape, and how does that relate to the ideas put forth in Capital is Dead and Hacker Manifesto, and what everyone else is working on.
Yeah, I mean, the most striking thing where I live right here in central Queens, I'm from the roof of my building, you can see Elmhurst Hospital, which was the absolute center of the pandemic in the United States when this whole thing started. You can see from here, yeah? And the 7 o'clock cheer for healthcare workers when it first started was this roar, because we're all around the hospital. And a lot of people here are connected to that, either because they have people they know who are in there or who work there. Because it's a working class neighborhood, but I'm in the little middle class bubble in the middle of it, yeah, which is really quite different. The thing is that, I'm one of those people who is able to work in safe conditions during Corona, because it's all I do is information. It's not ideal. Now, obviously, and a whole series of companies are capturing value out of that, yeah? Like the thing we should say about Zoom, because we're on it, and I think somebody else is on YouTube somewhere else, yeah, is those companies are extracting value out of this. They don't really give a damn what we say, but they're interested in the pattern that you could find from it, yeah? So there's this labor that's ongoing. Like there are people who are in these like really awful situations are trying to keep working, but it's all of the work directly with physical things, yeah? So like the idea of like forcing meat plant workers to go back to work, right? Or designating people essential workers so they can't go on unemployment and exposing themselves to risk. And in my neighborhood, this means mostly people of color, right? Are then going to be much more exposed, much more likely to die. So you see this like bifurcation. That part of the economy that runs on information will actually sort of keep going in these, not pleasant situations, but where there's relative safety. But the residual part, that's the service industry that, keeps that dominant part going, that's where far more people are dying. So I think one could even sort of like view it through this lens of how unequally it's falling on different kinds of people. And then to those who are most affected, of course, we have to have people in prisons and detention centers who are part of that kind of labor mostly, yeah, who are then also hyper exposed. So I think there's a class dimension to exposure even before we get to a ruling class, who ironically are then, exposed through all the fucking servants coming and going, right? That they didn't really think about. But even within the kind of what I would want to be a kind of class alliance, hacker worker class alliance, there's a difference we have to address about how this impacts people. And I'm speaking to you from the Congressional 14th, right? We sent Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez to Congress based on that class alliance, yeah? Like that's why I think this has kind of purchased this particular neighborhood.
Alex, Jasper, if you want to jump in, feel free.
But what I find interesting about the account that we just got, where there's on the one hand kind of telecommuting white collar workers and then essential workers that are still being asked to work, and that's very true, and that is for the most part a highly classed divide. What's missing from that is this whole class of kind of workers that are service workers, but that can't work because that kind of service work is deemed to be too dangerous, right? And I think that that's the unemployment. That's the 30-40% unemployment that we're going to see eventually develop over, maybe not that high, but probably 30, develop over the course of the summer. And it's largely people who work in kind of face-to-face service kind of jobs, and they're not very high tech. It's the kind of result of the technologization of the economy. So, in San Francisco, for example, you have this whole class of tech workers, but then there's all these kind of service jobs that kind of follow behind them. And Oakland and Berkeley, where I live, are not really very different. And so, and what I've seen is this transformation of cities over places where I've lived over the last 10 years, so that essentially all of the jobs are in this kind of in-person service sector, or in tech work, or maybe a little bit in the university, and people work more and more of them because the rent is getting higher and higher, and then they all went away. But it really shows, to me, it just shows how we don't really live in the kind of sort of hacker universe that we thought we were going to live in the 90s, where everybody was doing some kind of tech work. There's a lot of kind of mundane labor, just because I think our society is based on labor. And I think that's true even of the vectors. And I like the idea of vector because I think rightly what you show is that it's about controlling the infrastructure and the kind of access, but that infrastructure and access can be controlled because it's often physical and material, and a lot of labor goes into making it. That's why you can hold on to it, because the data centers are made out of stuff. And the actual structure, the actual vector, the vectors are the same. And to me, that's not actually different than Archer Daniels Midland building a bunch of, grain silos and the infrastructure to distribute grain, in the 20th century. Is the same way of kind of, extracting value from a value chain. And I'm not saying nothing's different. I think the technical transformations of capitalism are totally fascinating. And I think we probably agree a lot about a lot of that, what that looks like. I'm just, I think that in some sense, we live very much in a kind of a world of, that's a lot more based on physical labor than we thought. And I feel like that's, in a way, that's what, or not physical labor, but kind of labor that can't be kind of televised. And I think that in a way that this moment sort of reminds us of that, but also reminds us how we could get rid of a bunch of stuff that we maybe don't really even need, and, organize society in a more, humane way.
I just, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah.
No, please.
No, I was going to say, I could have put a little more stress on, the information is a little weird. And we use the term silo, both for actual grain silos of the kind that used to exist when I was in my hometown. We all talk about information being in silos, but information does work a little differently to other kinds of materiality. And the thing is that, me having this ginger ale precludes Alex from having it. Any piece of this I share is a piece I wouldn't have, but we have the same information at the same time. Like, the sharing of it doesn't preclude the thing existing or having value. And it's kind of like deeply weird. And I wanted to not lose the, sort of ontological side of it, that, I really think something new kind of enters the world when you separate information from its material substrate. And it's a thing that you can then firstly quantify and then, build a science on. but also kind of circulate and share. And the circulating and sharing of it kind of is the possible basis of doing the transformation to another kind of society. Like that was the other point, that there might be kind of crucial piece for thinking about what is it that the production of information as a form of materiality would allow in the world. And then you see, I think, quite clearly how this particular arrangement of, human abilities and natural resources simply cannot generate that and doesn't do it. I think Jasper's point's well taken, that yes, there's a kinds of labor that can't be done, which was kind of like mostly service work. The service work that often kind of exists in the first place to do the human management around the edges of information systems, because none of us like how this stuff's actually built. So somebody has to be there to soften the blow. And then the other thing was how much of that service work has got to do with that like massive redistribution of income upwards. That's kind of like the failure of the classic labor movement to prevent that happening. It's the thing that happened all over the overdeveloped world. And that's a kind of defeat that kind of really needs to be accounted for, I think. It's like, why did we lose? And maybe it's because the terms in which we thought it weren't adequate to the task.
I just wanted to add just a brief remark about that. I thought Jasper put it well when he argued that or pointed out that so far the state has either been unwilling or powerless to interfere in the sphere of production. That and that the response to the crisis is actually quite similar to 2008, but in hyperdrive. It seems to me all talk of the end of neoliberalism, I think, should be met with intense skepticism by the left. What we see, in fact, is a kind of a bailout of Wall Street on steroids. I mean, it couldn't be clearer in this crisis, because the actual means-tested checks that have gone out to some Americans, many, I think I read almost 40% or more, have yet to receive any stimulus, and that's for those who make it below the kind of Pelosi democratic standard for what counts as deserving of aid in this, so the fact that these $1,200 checks went out to some people, not all, because the states internally can actually distribute them because of right to work, workfare schemes, while a lending facility handled personally by Steve Mnuchin has distributed trillions of dollars. It's not only buying corporate bonds, assets, equities, ETFs, but it's actually run by BlackRock, one of the largest managers of financial assets I think the largest in the world. So what it shows to me is that not only didn't 2008 break the kind of the model of development that we've been in for the last 40 or so years, but we see the kind of really perverse acceleration of those dynamics in this crisis. Now, it's not the case, I think, that that neoliberalism is hegemonic in the sense that it can command positive support, because I think there's a growing awareness that this is unfair. And you can read the Financial Times. Martin Wolf says it's unfair. Mark Carney, the governor of the Bank of England, was in The Economist last week, saying that, talking like Keynes about the economic future and possibilities of our grandchildren. And yet when any sort of counter movement emerges of a social democratic, popular frontist kind, the kind that McKenzie was talking about, it's beyond the pale. So, I mean, I'm talking about a lot of different things here. I guess my main point is just that, it's quite incredible to see the incapacity and unwillingness of the state to interfere in any but the kind of financial circuitry of our economy, which is, in part accounts for the fact that even during this crisis, we see the upward redistribution of wealth in a neoliberal way.
Yeah.
Maybe it would make sense to call it post-labor movement capitalism, because it all tracks with the defeat of the labor movement in the late 60s, early 70s. I'm honestly just, frankly shocked that Marxists think neoliberal capitalism is an adequate description, because you're saying that a set of ideas created by European economists in the 30s that became an economic policy in the 80s is the thing that governs the era. That's not a materialist analysis. It's idealism is the language we would have used for that. What were the material conditions of possibility Like, number one, defeat the labor movement. But number two, what was the resource with which that was done? And it's technical. It's like routing around the point of blockage where the strike or the action would have happened. Like, those are the two, sort of fundamental things. So, like, obviously we don't disagree about what's going on. It's just like, where is there an explanation for that? And saying, well, suddenly there was a new set of economic ideas that took hold, and they go on. Like, that's not Marxism.
I wanted to return briefly to a point you made earlier, McKenzie, about the non-rival property of information, because I think that's something that to me was really fundamental in helping me see the world in this new, I guess, like leftist way, because I fell in love with the open source movement when I was pretty young, and the idea of intellectual property has always felt to me like something of a scam, but I couldn't really quite explain why. And I think there's something about what several of you were saying earlier about contracts, and how we're in an era of capitalism where we have these kinds of laws around intellectual property that are different from 100 years ago, when we didn't have this kind of information. And I think there's something about that feels kind of wrong, especially to someone who has a kind of hacker mentality, where they see the existence of intellectual property and they know it doesn't feel right. But without this like broader critical analysis that recognizes how property is central to capitalism, it can be hard to understand, what is the mode of resistance? How do you resist intellectual property law? How do you resist the commodification of information if you don't understand how that's central to capitalism? So that's what I found really powerful about Hacker Manifesto, and I would definitely recommend that book to anyone who has that kind of anti-intellectual property background. And just quick question from the audience. This starts with a quote from Michel de Certeau. "There's nowhere to hide in the practice of everyday life. Therefore, how do we practice living in the vectorless age? And how are these practices different from their apparently capitalist predecessors?"
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up the idea of like the non-rivalrous good, which in neoclassical economics doesn't make any sense at all. Yeah, it's like the whole point is that goods are separate things and they're scarce. And then you suddenly have this good that isn't. So like, how do you do that? And then you notice it took 2 waves for what I call vectorless class to figure out how to do that. And that, there's bits that you lock down and you design entire information architectures on keeping the crown jewels, right? And distributing the labor. The object-oriented ontology is a way of distributing labor while not letting anybody know what exactly they're working on, and on and on. I could elaborate this description. But yeah, the thing I thought when I wrote Hacker Manifesto is that, in the non-rivalrous good, there's a whole other sphere of possibility that is being shut down. What I didn't see coming is the way that you can commodify the non-rivalrous at the next level. There's a little level of abstraction that companies like Google figured out, which is like, let them build all their websites and share everything. We'll just control access. We'll control, as you said, the gateway in between that. And we'll sort of build a brand that will be embedded in everybody's head. There's a bit from the old culture industry. This still works, which is like, brands and celebrities, like part of the value of Google is in your head. It's the fact that you know what Google is. Like, they outsource some of the value to you to keep reproducing because you remember it. So there are bits of it that survive in that sense. The IP piece that's probably more important to talk about is like patent and the growth of things that you could patent, the narrowness of things that you can patent. And then also that copyright is now basically goes on forever. Like, we've sort of given up this idea that that the crucial stuff will return to the commons. So that does mean that in the information sphere, as in the everyday that de Certeau was talking about, you sort of really push to the margin. And what was key in the way de Certeau thought was, the whole thing about a ruling class is they have strategies, all you have is tactics. Tactics are on a smaller scale than strategies. Strategies are ensembles of tactics. It's very, very hard to get your tactics together as a counter strategy. This is also Gramsci. This is counter hegemony is hard. Like hegemony is able to add things together. So I think we are very much in the margins, and de Certeau was already interested in talking about everyday life, an idea he straight up stole from Henri Lefebvre, which I think is a more interesting version of it, but in the same territory. It's sort of very much, I think, a little bit how sometimes you want to be a little bit discreet about things as well. Not everything needs to be on YouTube and Twitter or whatever. That languages can sort of say one thing and mean another. And that what were really less working class and more underclass ways of navigating a world of surveillance are things to kind of learn from at this particular point. Yeah, like how not to be a little bit overt about everything all the time.
All right, great. Thanks for that. So another question from the audience for the whole panel. So I think that this first bit is just for McKenzie. How would you account for the self-reproduction of the hacker-vectorless class relation? And then for the rest of the panel, how do you see this account as divergent from the traditional explanation of capitalism? Or is this account within the historical horizon of the capitalist class? Hopefully I'm asking that question right.
Yeah, and we'll disagree about that. But and the thing about hacker classes is that there are people whose primary function is the production of new information, but there's a way in which it kind of gets outsourced to all of us. Like it's all of our jobs basically to do product development now. Everything that's released is really not ready for prime time now. And you really just outsource figuring out how it doesn't work. You could not make a car like that. You know, like you get your ass sued when these things kill people. So like you had to make the car right, and then it would go out and you'd fix a few little things that you didn't learn later. But now we're all continually producing the information that makes everything work. So how is like the production of information happening partly by a specialized class, partly by extracting it, not only out of people, but out of things? Like that's the other thing, is that things in the world now report data that have value, yeah? Like weather is commodified, like is kind of just one example, yeah? You know, automatically gathered data about, you know, crops before anybody even bothers to measure it or factor it into a whole series of models and calculations and ways of extracting derivative value. So yeah, how do all of us become information producers, but not extractors of the value of the thing that we produce? So one could think a kind of information social reproduction theory on top of that, to think not just the production, but the reproduction, which brings us to the crucial role that the university used to have and why it's so much under pressure at the moment. Like precisely because it was this kind of, you know, sort of significant institution that produced information for a few specialized things, but its role really changed from the 80s onwards, when universities were able to own the IP of things that they developed out of state funds. So universities have this like really main function of doing the high risk research that's not necessarily immediately commodifiable, so that the vectorless class can come in and find the bits of it that, you know, from which value can be extracted. Yeah, that's kind of like the Stanford University model. Yeah.
Alex or Jasper, if you want to jump in, go ahead.
You want it, Alex, or? Well, I guess there's a that's the part where I'm kind of least sure about the theory, in the sense that I'm not sure I really see a hacker class. I mean, I certainly see the figure of the hacker as kind of woven through both the workplace and kind of capitalist organizations. I mean, I think it's kind of, it's quite interesting the way that hacker culture has been both kind of resistant to and taken up by capitalism. And that's certainly clear. But I think in most cases where the hacker is a class, they seem to me workers, or we're talking about, you know, new forms of kind of petty proprietorship and piecework that are certainly a feature of the current moment, but that also have their kind of predecessors in older forms of capitalism, which did weird things with piecework and gig work and outsourcing and cottage industry, and certainly that, you know, that kind of thing has always been happening in kind of in different countries where capitalism is organized in really different ways, and kind of, you know, there's a lot more kind of kind of familial structures of capitalism. So there's a lot of possibilities, I think, for things to still be kind of within a kind of labor capital relationship. So, but I think it's interesting to understand gig work and these things in terms of how wage labor is changing, and also the kind of informalization of labor, right? The kind of informal economy, where kind of these weird forms of petty proprietorship and kind of sort of lumpen capitalism exist. And there's a lot to be said about that. And I think that that's something that's kind of always been growing in the world. It's now, I think, in some ways a feature of life in the United States, increasingly too. Then on the capitalist side, in terms of the vectoralist class, to me, I guess I would just be, I mean, I think this is my vulgar Marxism, is that I think in many ways it's, what we're talking about, if vectoralists are kind of rent-seeking capital, capitalists simply trying to kind of own things and make rent off it. But I think oftentimes that's not actually just what's happening. It's not purely about title in most of the cases. There is a lot of labor going on into kind of turning that information into some kind of product. And oftentimes attempt to kind of make it a consumer product or a process product for other capitalists, or kind of service sold. And so it's not, simply, it's not like, if we think of the pure example of the kind of rent-seeking capitalist as somebody who just kind of, owns untouched land and makes money off of the ownership of itself, it's not exactly that. There's a lot going into kind of working up this information into kind of interfaces and data sets and things like that. So so that's how I think of it in terms of the typical Marxist machinery. That's mostly rent seeking, or an attempt to kind of make a process or a product thing out of information.
I basically, I largely agree with what Jasper just said. I guess the thing that I would just add, just because it hasn't been discussed very much yet, is the role of the state in all of this. The hacker is kind of the, well, I suppose it depends. I mean, I think McKenzie is using it in part as a kind of recuperation, a détournement. The fact that the hacker meant one thing in the 90s and today, has, I think you say at one point, kind of criminal connotations. And that's an interesting idea. When it comes to the vectoralist and the capitalist, it seems to me that a lot of these tech titans, the Zuckerbergs of the world, or one of the best things I thought about the Theranos documentary that was made out of the Keiru book, Bad Blood. It was really not foregrounded in the documentary, but George Shultz is on the board. They're dependent for this kind of completely faulty, literal black box that can't do any of the things that it claims to do, on state contracts, on military procurement, on a kind of asset, a kind of Keynesian, military Keynesianism. And I just sort of, I guess this doesn't entirely answer the question that was posed about where this fits into the classical Marxist scheme, but I just kind of would add that the state is often playing an important role here in sustaining these relations of production, as well as the forces of production.
Great. So I just want to ask one last question for the audience. I'm going to paraphrase this a little bit, but so the question is, so what is the role of information in, the historical modes of production? Hasn't information kind of always been a factor? And if that's the case, if what we have now is just kind of like more information, more successful use of information, why does that necessarily merit a new kind of historical form? Why do we have to see it as this just new kind of mode of production?
Yeah, the thing about that argument is it applies to everything. If you want to say, well, information always existed, therefore there's nothing new. It's like, well, making things always existed, so capitalism's nothing new. Farming land always existed, so feudalism wasn't anything new. Forms of administration based on written documents kind of always existed, so the Chinese state was nothing new. Like, you can just sort of like, the thing with that example is it's sort of like somewhat selectively used. But when does information start to become something a little different to the sort of ordinary everyday use of it? The answer is really World War II, and the reasons for that's good. And this connects us to that question of the state. You know, the reasons for that's interesting, rather, is not good at all. You know, the war in the Pacific was the largest logistical enterprise ever attempted in the history of humans up until that point. How on earth do you do that? Yeah. You know, like the literal Pentagon was built to run the thing. It took, you know, trial and error for the wartime administration to figure out that, all right, so like rubber and steel should be the kinds of commodities you use that sort of legislation with sort of the states not using now, right? All right, we need rubber, we need steel, we need canvas. So, you know, we'll use state direction to control all those things. The one they forgot was typewriters. Like no one really thought it through. It's like, oh, we actually need a massive amount of typewriters. So the state needs someone to produce those, specifically to run the biggest logistic enterprise ever. And when people really started to think about, there's got to be ways to automate this. We're using, you know, thousands of people were employed to be computers in the 40s, and those people were women. Yeah. It was women who used to do all that sort of stuff. And then it's like, how do you reduce that workforce, reduce error? How do you speed it up was the main thing, yeah? And the famous story that's told is about code breaking, to like speed up, you know, what's basically a sort of probabilistic attempt to figure out, you know, the meaning of a message. But you would just like permutate fast enough so that you get an answer before it was old news, right? But it's a sort of a similar problem. If like this information is going backwards and forwards over like billions of units of stuff to fight a war in the Pacific, how can the state organize that? So the very beginnings of information as we currently understand it is the war, because of the complexity of the operations that were being attempted. Absolutely unprecedented and really not like things that have happened since the dawn of time. And we sort of tend to retrospectively use our modern understanding of information to understand the past. You could have an information theory of how feudalism worked, right? But that's not a concept that anybody understood at the time. Although the famous argument about how many angels can dance on the head of a pin is actually an argument about information. It's just no one knows that's what they're arguing about yet, right? Does information have physical spatiality, or is it completely immaterial? It's essentially what that argument is. Turns out there's a limited number to how many angels can actually dance on the head of a pin, right? Because information is not completely spiritual and ideal or whatever, it's material. All right, so initially it's the Pentagon that is funding the growth of information technologies. The Pentagon is the reason that Silicon Valley is where it is, because it grew out of aerospace, and aerospace was in California for a lot of reasons, but partly because of the war in the Pacific, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a long thread of state involvement in this, but it definitely goes through stages. And all of the initial foundational information science that all this is based on was produced really by, you could call it military Keynesianism, but the wartime version of it is almost like military socialism. You know, somebody literally arrived from Britain with a suitcase full of the best tech anybody had, with one bodyguard, and went to MIT, and they just unpacked it and built all that shit. Like nobody thought about IP until later. It's where the idea of engineers collaborating directly with scientists also started. Yeah, it was really not a thing that happened in these sorts of fields at all. Like mathematicians directly involved with electrical engineers. Like this is everyday common or garden thing now. This is invented by wartime exigencies. The thing is that all of that becomes a thing that the corporate world starts to play with really at the end of the 70s out of necessity. And the new necessity is breaking the power of labor at one of its high points. Yeah, can't extract any more productivity out of labor, wages are rising. So let's root around labor's capacity to stop production, which is labor's power. Let's root around particularly the ability to strike by stopping the plant, because there are actually 20 plants we could get this thing made in, because we can move the information around, we can do the logistics, move the goods. So that's kind of the thing that's novel about this. Then you build it out as a kind of consumer-facing thing where, and this was the whole struggle around things like Napster, for those who go back that far. You know, like the entertainment business really took a long time to get their head around this. It's like, wait, what? You've separated the information from the physical layer, and it's almost lossless. and the cost of copying is plummeting towards zero, and the cost of storage is dropping towards zero, how are we going to make any money? Well, part of it is, the entertainment business wanted control of your computer, which they got, right? So they're in there and have a whole series of ways to know what you're doing, and are continually modifying your computer without you knowing it or giving you permission to do that, so they can retain one form of property. But the more interesting version with stuff like Google is like, great, free information. Let's just follow the dance, aggregate it, and that's our value, is that we will know more than anybody else will. So yeah, you got to ask, does Google know more than the NSA these days? That's relevant information. Like that would be the first time, like state-based intelligence used to be the thing that knew more than everybody else. That might no longer be true. And that might be one of the sort of scarier things here. Not that it's necessarily a good thing that the state knows more than corporations, but it's definitely worse than it was when you have the NSA plus Google, plus Apple, plus whoever, So it's like they always talk about every example of the surveillance state that you hear in the popular media is about how terrible China is, and it probably is in those terms. But everything that's ever said about it is stuff that also happens here. Yeah, like reputation ranking, controlling your access to social goods and services, that's your credit rating. Like that already works. You're already resident on dozens of databases, and both state and corporations are figuring out your value and whether you're expendable based on that. And that's what's being used against everybody now. And no one had the capacity to do that a century ago. Yeah. So what is this new thing? Maybe it needs a new language. Maybe we need to think about a different politics, a different affective range. Like the way people feel about work is different to what it was. Who does the work is different. So yeah, I don't know. I feel like Marx was someone who is, the great poet of his century in terms of making a language that understood not only his times, but the times to come. But we're still using that language. It may account for our time and times past, but I don't think it accounts for times future.
Great point. And now I want to turn to Philip. Do you have any questions or comments?
There's a fascinating discussion, and I'll just make a couple of comments that occurred to me as I was listening. Three, basically. One is about the question of using the ancient philosophical distinction between essence and appearance, or abusing it, and always finding the same essence underneath, which I think is one of those things that McKenzie is protesting about in kind of Marxist thought. You always arrive at the same essence. So none of what's new is captured at all in what you're saying. But the question is, I would have for that is that simply a question of how well you use the distinction between essence and appearance? If you use it in a pedestrian way, you could be writing Stalin stuff. Or if you use it in a very thoughtful way, perhaps you can essentially, turn out something worth watching. I really don't know. I mean, I can see the comedy of ending up precisely with the same things. So I would pose that question at all. Is that useful to us now still, the difference between essence and appearance? I appeal to it all the time, but I can recognize that it might seem like a get out of jail free card. So that would be, if you want to comment, I'll stop for that.
Yeah, I sort of don't want to get into the conceptual weeds, but to put it in the context of the material production of Marxist theory, and like it's ironic that all my Marxist theory books were published by Verso, because my whole project for 6 books is basically arguing against the Perry Anderson view of what Western Marxism was, right? That it can't be governed by a kind of philosophical party, that it has to be a kind of collaboration of all forms of knowledge. And I think we ended up with privileging a conceptual language that would identify an essence and then treat everything else as epiphenomena, precisely because of that move. And the background to that is the shutting down during the Cold War of the other versions of Marxism that were much more grounded in technical scientific thought, and the loss of which I really grieve for. I think that was like a massive setback. The defeat of Bernalism, as it was called in Britain in the 50s, the retreat of the scientific left, into simply opposing nuclear war. That was important, but that was all they felt they could do and keep their jobs. There's like a huge loss to thinking through materiality in a more sort of complex, nuanced way.
Right. I can see an argument that would start by saying, look, you don't act on modes of production. You know, you're in a social formation and you're at a particular conjuncture, and that is composed of such hybrid material that you really have to be attentive to that as you're formulating what you're going to do. But I'm not going to take that direction. I'm going to try to kind of restate at least the distinction that there's something underneath. And you know, there's this good capitalism, bad capitalism discourse. Elizabeth Warren will have it where, you know, small businessman Adam Smith and so forth is right. Piketty has won with progressive taxation, and they all go. And the question I always ask is, what is it that capitalism can't stop doing without ceasing to be capitalism? And I think we got the answer to that in spades during the pandemic, about 3 weeks after, when everybody wanted, you know, it wasn't just lieutenant governors from Texas who were saying, we got to get back to work. That's much worse than what's happening. It was Thomas Friedman who came out with the first article, as is totally appropriate, in the New York Times. He says, wait a second, our response is much worse. You know, and all I could think when I watched this is so naked and explicit. It's ridiculous. It's like Ginsburg's Moloch. You know, you have this big god called the economy, which is Moloch, and you're shoving all these bodies in. Capitalism can't have all sorts of people suddenly deciding we're not going to work. You know, and we can even call that, without appealing to abstract labor and other things, a kind of labor theory of value. That's why Keynes' notion of economics for our grandchildren, where all of a sudden we're working for 15 hours for 3 days, and the work is divided among everybody, and we have a lot of leisure, could never happen. That's why, you know, Peter Fraze in his anti-Star Trek society says, if we had, you know, thing where everything was free through replicators, they would have to invent absolute artificial scarcity by using intellectual property. It seems to me that MCM prime, endless accumulation, is the motor that's driving everything underneath. Whatever else is happening on the surface, that doesn't mean you can act directly on that motor. And it certainly means that you have to understand and look at the various forms as to how capital is able to continue after it's been predicted. You know, what do they say? It's the left has predicted 23 out of the last 4 depressions, you know, and you know, I'm mystified myself as to how through financialization, and I'm not talking about just using it as hedging for futures or something, but how, you know, this is substituted for pure speculation, is substituted for productive activity. We're still in a kind of slowdown, but it still manages to go on. And I'm not sure exactly how, but I know mainstream economics is not trying to answer it. It keeps introducing epicycles. And I know that there's no such thing as Marxist economics, I think. It's just a critique of political economy. It's looking at the categories that mainstream economics, bourgeois economics, whatever you want to call it, marginalism produces, and why these categories don't correspond to what's actually going on in society. So if we think of Marx as being part of a scientific research program, and I'm borrowing from Lakatos and mixing him up with a little Kuhn here, we can say that the mainstream economics is a degenerative research program. It's not producing any results. What we're trying to do with the Marx research program is to take what still works and what explains things to us and kind of look around and try to figure out why it's still moving, you know? And it's a collective project, and all of us have a part of it. But I have no answers as to why. So at any rate, I could sit here and talk with all of you for hours. And I hope we will have a chance to talk about this again. I'm getting addicted to the Zoom, having a Zoom portion of Red May every year, because you can bring people from everywhere, you know, in addition to bringing people live. It'd be fun to have you live too at Red May, and, you know, do your Bogdanov talk. But thanks very much, McKenzie, Wark, Jasper, Bernes, Alexander, Zevin, and Wendy Liu. It's a fascinating discussion that I, for one, will listen to again and again, or watch online. I would like to address our viewers and to go back to that MCM prime question for us. Well, it's not really, though we do like to extract a lot of surplus value out of our guests. But we would like our viewers to contribute. You can do it on www.redmayseattle.org. Click on donate, or you can go to the YouTube description of the event. There's a link there. Click on that. We raised about $2,000. We've got to get to $12,000, but I'm an optimist. I think that money is going to start raining down. And so, leaving on that positive note, I wish you all good health and intellectual stimulation, and good night from Red May.